Hello, everybody. Welcome to A Better Question and our Worst Questions episode for everybody's favorite legitimized fairy tale, The Curious Case of Mr. Wright. If you haven't seen the Mr. Wright episode, there's a link right over there and one at the end of this video. When I set out to prove or disprove the story of Mr. Wright, the first place I looked was with the doctor from the story. If he had said, "That never happened, stop using my name," problem solved. But if Dr. Philip West ever said anything like that, I couldn't find it. And I wanted to find out why he never challenged the story or mentioned it at all. Trying to track down and answer that question absolutely consumed my life for nearly a month. Because every time I tracked down more information, it only raised increasingly insane questions. Questions which related to secret societies, the FBI, communists, homosexuality, and how one of the world's foremost cancer researchers vanished from history. And in this episode of Worst Questions, I'll take you through it. I'm going to assume that you took my advice and watched the episode on Mr. Wright before coming to this video. But here's a brief recap just in case. Mr. Wright was a terminal cancer patient, and Dr. Philip West was his physician. Philip West is the guy in the story who injected his patient with purified water, lied about it being a revolutionary cancer cure, and caused Mr. Wright, his patient, to heal himself through the power of positive belief. The whole story of Mr. Wright was probably created, but definitely spread, by a guy named Bruno Klopfer. Klopfer was a psychologist who was sure that he could determine everything from your sexual orientation to how fast your cancer would kill you based on your responses to little pictures of ink blots. Klopfer laid out the whole Mr. Wright story in a speech he gave to a society of psychologists who specialized in projective tests. The Rorschach was just one of many projective tests, but it was the one that Bruno Klopfer championed. And this whole society relied on the idea that your subconsciousness could manifest in the real world. Bruno Klopfer uses the story of how Mr. Wright cured his own cancer through the power of belief as his primary example of the strength of this connection. For added legitimacy, Bruno Klopfer claims the Mr. Wright story is a quoted case study given to him by world-renowned cancer researcher Dr. Philip West. And while the story itself is horseshit, Dr. West was a real guy. I found more than enough evidence to disprove the story of Mr. Wright beyond any reasonable doubt, but it would have been a lot easier if West had simply called bullshit and forced Bruno to retract the story. So why didn't he? For that matter, why did Klopfer use West's name at all? If your whole plan is to borrow the name of a famous scientist to legitimize your work, why not pick a dead one? Living people have a way of coming after you when you lie about them. And West was alive for 7 years after Klopfer's speech. I could only think of a few possible explanations for all of this. There's the possibility West made up the story of Mr. Wright and gave it to Klopfer. But West wouldn't benefit from people hearing the story of Mr. Wright. Whereas for Bruno Klopfer, the story legitimizes his theories. There's also the possibility West had no idea Klopfer stuck his name on a pseudoscience fairy tale. It's also possible he did know, but didn't care or thought responding was beneath him. And finally, there's the chance that West knew, but was powerless to respond. And in that case, it's also possible Klopfer knew West couldn't respond. Like I said, I spent a month trying to figure this out. If you have any information about West, Klopfer, UCLA cancer trials in 1951, whatever, please get in touch. I was never able to prove what really happened, but here's what I did uncover, and why that last explanation is the one that best fits all the facts. When I say West basically disappeared from academics, I should probably explain why I don't think this is a case of a guy who got fed up at work and resolved to spend more time fishing or something. For one, scientists occupied a different place in society back in the 50s. We really don't have famous scientists today. Yeah, there's a few, but I would argue that they lean more toward famous than scientist. But in the 1950s, we were at the dawn of the atomic age. Jet airplanes, new cars, new appliances, there was new technology everywhere, and Americans had enough money to afford it on a single income, provided you looked like these folks. The Cold War hadn't really got started yet. America didn't even need a huge military because for a little bit, nobody else had nukes, so they could right off. There was such a sense of optimism in the American middle class. The end of disease, washable living rooms, flying cars, the cure for cancer. All of these things seemed to be 20 years away. And all of that was thanks to scientists. Einstein, Oppenheimer, von Braun, Salzard, suit-wearing, pipe-smoking, intellectual men of science were famous in a way that we don't really see today. If that description of scientists seems racist and or sexist as fuck, Well, yeah, it was. But I'm just trying to give you the context of what I mean when I say Dr. Philip Manthorne West was a famous scientist. This wasn't some noodly back-of-the-lab weirdo I dug up who just happened to invent something cool. No, this was a guy who won National Man of the Year. He was portrayed as an up-and-coming eligible bachelor who invented a way to see if chemotherapy worked. He went on a lecture tour in Europe. The LA Times thought it was newsworthy if he was speaking at a luncheon. I even found a clip of him passing out sage advice to new high school graduates in a newspaper clipping from across the country. Dr. West is written up in Time magazine, Science, Nature, and he published more and more papers every year until, poof, he just stopped. That's what I mean when I say he disappeared. And if something happened to him, it happened right around here. So, what was Dr. West up to in 1954? And what does this have to do with gay communists? After anything bad happens, it's natural to analyze everything that led up to that fateful moment. After all, every car crash started as a normal trip to somewhere. For West, his collision with controversy started around 1950. That's when West had a conversation with another cancer doctor about how it sucked that cancer seemed to quickly kill their nice and intelligent patients, while the idiots and assholes were the ones who recovered. As scientists, West and his colleague decided that they should test if their feelings about their patients had any basis in reality, or if they were just, the obvious emotional bias that makes you notice the times when the people you like die and the people who suck end up perfectly fine. So when a plucky psych grad student showed up to help in the cancer ward, West and his colleague, Dr. Ellis, put that psych student to work to test their anecdote-derived theory. This psych student was getting his PhD. And the thing about getting your PhD is that you work under the senior academics in your department. In the case of this student, that meant his thesis work was done under the influence of UCLA's psychology faculty, which included none other than Bruno Klopfer. As near as I can tell, Klopfer was only involved in this study at its final stages, and maybe not even until after the study was over, but the data had yet to be analyzed. The only evidence I can find that West and Klopfer ever had any interaction is that West introduced Klopfer as kind of a bonus panelist during the symposium that presented the findings of their study. The important thing is that it's this study that brought Klopfer and West together. Even though by together, I mean West introduced him at a symposium and Klopfer looked at like 20-odd patient records. That's it. There's zero evidence that West was ever alone in a room with Klopfer, never mind knew him well enough to send him letters. But 6 years later, Klopfer is again inserting himself into this study like he helped run it, and he says the Mr. Wright story came from a personal communication from West. So there's nothing to show Klopfer and West ever had any other direct involvement with each other whatsoever. But indirectly, there is another study they both contributed to. A study which would eventually lead to the psychology establishment delisting homosexuality as a disorder in the DSM. It's also possibly the last research West ever did. West's early 50s foray into the world of psychology led to his involvement with another psych study happening at UCLA, a study on people labeled as sex psychopaths or deviants. It's not clear who suggested this, but somebody said, hey, we use psychology tests to help show if someone's cancer would progress quickly or slowly. Maybe we can use the blood tests from cancer research to see if there's a physiological pattern with psychology. Among the patients committed to Norwalk were men arrested for homosexuality. At the time, homosexuality was considered a mental disorder, unnatural, temporary, and treatable. Some of the thinking at the time came from good old bias and bigotry, but some of it came from scientific conclusions based on awful data. Research on homosexuality before 1950, with the exception of Kinsey in 48, was laughably non-scientific. For example, the Army was looking for a test to identify homosexuals because they wouldn't let homosexuals serve in the Army. And they were paranoid that people would claim to be gay to get out of duty. So maybe they could figure out a way to see who was faking or not. Klopfer and other researchers suggested the Rorschach test to identify homosexuals for the US Army in the 1940s. Besides these completely non-scientific studies, there were others done on the only readily available test subjects, namely people who were committed to mental hospitals or prisons, which meant conclusions about homosexuality from these studies were basically best guesses and bullshit, or they came from a sample set which included violent sexual criminals. So To make matters worse, homosexuality wasn't just a disorder in the eyes of medical science, it was also a crime in the eyes of law enforcement. Speaking practically, this meant that finding a partner as a gay man in LA came with the horrifying problem of trying to figure out if your date was a cop. Entrapment was a common practice among LA vice cops of the 1940s and 50s. And how to say this without getting demonetized? There are many accounts of gay men inviting their dates into their homes to continue the date in a more private and possibly less clothed setting. And afterward, instead of cuddling, they got, "Thanks for the great time, you're under arrest." And those were the dates that didn't end in beatings or worse. Responding to a case of this exact kind of entrapment, the first organized pro-homosexual civil rights advocacy group was formed, the Mattachine Foundation. Soon afterward, the first pro-homosexual publication was organized, One Magazine. And it's in One Magazine's second issue, with a fairly limited circulation, that a letter appears from none other than Dr. Philip M. West of UCLA. In his letter, West practically begs members of the Mattachine Society and readers of One Magazine to participate in the scientific study of homosexuality, so that data can be collected from normal, successful, healthy members of society who just happen to be homosexual. He refers to homosexuality as a consistently occurring natural variation, and he wanted to combat prejudice against it with education and cold hard facts. The intention behind West's letter is obvious. What is less obvious is how it got to One Magazine to begin with. How did West know where to send it? How did West know a group like the Mattachine Foundation even existed? And if this letter from West represented a group of researchers, why was West the person chosen to write it? And what was he thinking when he signed his name? This was One Magazine's second issue. How a cancer researcher knew enough about the civil rights situation, the underground groups, and the relevant UCLA research to make this plea is hard to explain. And that's before any guesses about his motivation. But the thing is, it worked. Eventually, the partnership between UCLA researchers and the Mattachine Society led to a study which was hailed as a watershed moment in the evolution of human rights in America, but not before a bit of intimidation by the FBI. In the 1950s, the FBI was run by J. Edgar Hoover. Hoover is the reason that there is a term limit of 10 years for any director of the FBI. Those were instituted to make sure that no leader of the Bureau would ever have the time to get dirty secrets on literally everybody, ideally to prevent that person from blackmailing the world into his back pocket. But in 1951, no such luck. Hoover loved his mother, his FBI, and his deputy director, Clyde Tolson. Hoover hated the communists and the moral deviants he thought were threatening to destroy America. Clyde Tolson is the guy that Hoover promoted to assistant director, even though he only had 2 years of experience. He also traveled with Hoover, ate lunch with Hoover, spent holidays with Hoover, and inherited Hoover's estate and lived in his house after Hoover died. To Hoover, a secret society of gay men meeting to discuss how best to improve the situation for homosexuals in America was too enticing a target to pass up. It didn't really help the situation that one of the group's founders, Harry Hay, was a communist. I mean, they may as well have called it the We Love Stalin Club, come tell us secrets. And only a few months after the society began to meet regularly, a member got a visit from some less than cheerful FBI agents, the first visit of many. The FBI kept the group under surveillance for pretty much its entire existence. Thanks to a Freedom of Information Act request, you can read some of the case files today. A lot of those files are censored, but it's safe to assume that the FBI had a list of everyone in and associated with the Mattachine Society, even though the society itself used code names and initials in their actual meeting minutes, in an attempt to keep the identities of the members secret. The cloak and dagger stuff the Mattachine Society tried to do to keep the identities of their members secret didn't do anything to throw the G-men off the case. But it is sure frustrating as for me trying to read through meeting minutes looking for specific names. Yeah, I know they were living in constant fear, but what about my needs? These meeting notes make clear the emphasis the Mattachine Society put on research and science, and it's the code names from these minutes that make it difficult for me to figure out whose idea that was. As the society became more organized, so did the idea of finding a partner to help them conduct fair scientific research on homosexuality. And it's in this stage where some familiar initials first appear. PW. The Norwalk study on sex psychopaths evolved into a partnership between a few UCLA researchers and the Mattachine Society. One of the scientists involved with this project was a woman named Dr. Evelyn Hooker. As the story goes, she became interested in studying homosexuality after a former student and friend, who happened to be gay, urged her to get involved. What's not clear is how Dr. Hooker was introduced to the Mattachine Society specifically, though that note about PW looking for UCLA collaborators predates her involvement. That said, there's no doubt Dr. Hooker deserves the credit she's given. Without her ability to delicately navigate the politics involved, it's hard to see how this study would have been as successful as it turned out to be. What is strange is that Dr. West's role gets left out almost every time the story is retold. This despite his heavy involvement with the study, at least during its initial phases. Dr. Hooker eventually dedicated a huge part of her life to this topic. She immersed herself in the homosexual community as a friend, a researcher, and a tireless advocate. It's also clear from discussion notes that both of these researchers understood the precarious nature of this study. You gotta remember that all of this was new science at the time. In 2021, we know homosexuality is not a personality disorder or a chemical imbalance. So the idea that testing these things would show zero difference between a gay man and Joe Bob hetero isn't some kind of revelation. But in 1954, science didn't know that, and it actually went against the prevailing ideas of the time, which meant that West, Hooker, and the Mattachine Society had to face a troubling possibility. What if they found a detectable difference? What if they accidentally developed working gaydar? West himself noted that the most interested party would probably be the US Army. The consequences of giving the US Army an accurate way to identify homosexuals was something that they all had to consider. A lot of the research was done in secret. Hooker conducted interviews at her home and off UCLA property. For his part, West disguised his collection of blood samples by collecting them during a Red Cross blood drive. At times, doctors West and Hooker were conducting research simultaneously, with West handling the physiological side of the investigation and Hooker handling the psychological. As a result, both he and Dr. Hooker were guests of honor at the Mattachine Society's Constitutional Convention. But after the data was collected, West disappears from academics. Another 3 years would pass before any of the results from the study were published. The final paper focuses solely on the psychological aspects of the study. The physiological results are completely omitted, and West's involvement is nowhere to be found. It's not too surprising that West isn't thanked or cited in Hooker's paper. Her work in this initial study quickly diverged from the physiological research that West was doing, and there's no real reason his name should be included in the psych-focused paper published by Hooker. However, it is a little surprising that West's name doesn't show up anywhere else. Dr. Hooker's paper is probably one of the most influential psych publications of the last 100 years. So much so that the project itself has been studied. People from the periphery of the project, other researchers, associates, UCLA administrators, Mattachine Society members, and friends and family of Dr. Hooker, all of these people have been mentioned in the decades since the study was published. But West is not. But even though you can't find Dr. West's name on the final paper, you can find another one. Earlier, I mentioned Bruno Klopfer claimed that he could look at the Rorschach test of a heterosexual male and a homosexual male and determine which was which without them being labeled. Given that Bruno Klopfer was the guy for the Rorschach test, Dr. Evelyn Hooker gave him the chance to do just that kind of blind test. She sent Klopfer a bunch of Rorschach results without any other identifying information, and Dr. Hooker asked him could he please sort them into their respective groups. When Dr. Hooker showed Klopfer the mistakes he'd made, he told her why he actually knew which one was which all along. And when he realized Dr. Hooker's publication might illustrate the irrelevance of the Rorschach test, he asked her, "Are you trying to skin us alive?" When Klopfer turned out to be full of shit, it helped prove homosexuals weren't suffering from some kind of personality disorder. They were just, people, every bit as okay and capable of contributing to society as anybody else. This study was the first to show this remarkable at the time result, and it was published in January of 1957, in none other than the Journal for Projective Techniques, Bruno Klopfer's research journal. Bruno Klopfer probably deserves some credit for publishing a study demonstrating he couldn't back up his claims about the Rorschach. But before we start piling on the praise, consider this. Dr. Hooker's study was going to be published anyway. By publishing it in his journal, Klopfer had at least some say over how it was presented, which may have something to do with why the results of his failure were interpreted as proof that heterosexuals and homosexuals were just as likely to present a healthy personality, instead of proof that the Rorschach test is about as scientifically useful as asking someone the name of their dog, or whether they like mayo on a hamburger. Only a few months after Dr. Hooker's study was published in his journal, Klopfer tells the story of Mr. Wright, which he said came from Dr. West. All of this in a speech Klopfer delivered, I shit you not, 2 weeks after West's mother died in LA. And I know that because West signed her death certificate. I have no idea if Klopfer knew that had happened or if it's just a disgusting coincidence, but it is true. Hooker's study was published in the journal at the beginning of 1957. Klopfer gave his Mr. Wright speech in the middle of 1957, and then that speech was published as an article at the end of 1957. Add all of this up, and at this point it's probably pretty obvious what I'm suggesting. That it's possible Dr. West got caught up in the so-called Lavender Scare, the lesser-known but far more widespread and damaging version of the Red Scare of McCarthy-era America. McCarthy's witch hunt for communists was as damaging as it was fruitless, ultimately destroying dozens of lives while exposing precisely 0 spies. The Lavender Scare, barring homosexuals from government positions, ultimately destroyed the personal lives and careers of thousands and thousands of men and women, sometimes based solely on the suspicion they were homosexual. And I don't know if West was one of them. His concern for the homosexual community, his awareness of their fears, his bachelor lifestyle, and the timing of his actions are all pretty damn suggestive. And in 1954, suggestion alone could bring heavy consequences. When Dr. Hooker wrote the grant to fund her study, she was paid a visit by John Aberhart, the head of the National Institute of Mental Health Grants Division, who came across the country just to see her. Recalling this visit later, Dr. Hooker said, "Suppose I had wanted to do a study of lesbians. The first thing that would have happened, I'm convinced, is that they would have said, 'We think this bears investigation.' They would have been thinking, 'Perhaps she herself is a lesbian.' I think that may have been one question in John Aberhart's mind when he came and spent the day with me. He knew that if I was going to go into this field, I had to be above reproach. I would have to be as pure as the driven snow." For context, when Dr. Hooker says this bears investigation, she doesn't mean that her study is worthwhile. She means they would have looked into her and why she wanted to do the study. And by pure as the driven snow, she means they would have been looking for proof that she wasn't homosexual. Whether or not West received similar scrutiny is unknown. I do know this was an odd time at UCLA. They had instituted a loyalty oath in 1950, which resulted in the resignation of 63 professors, voluntarily or otherwise. There's also another case that might provide some insight into this situation, the case of Martha Deane. Martha Deane was a famous dance instructor and physical educator at UCLA. She was one of only 2 tenured female professors at the university at the time. And in an anonymous report to the UCLA administration, Deane's neighbor claimed to have seen into Deane's house and witnessed her kissing another woman. All of this happened in November of 1952. In response to this allegation, Deane was immediately told to leave UCLA property, and she was suspended without pay. The associate professor she'd supposedly kissed was forced to resign on the spot. After that, Deane relied on donations from friends to pay her living expenses. She sat in professional limbo while campus police tried to gather incriminating evidence against her. A year later, when a faculty tenure committee looked into the still unresolved case, they unanimously voted to reinstate Martha Deane. Instead, University Chancellor Raymond Allen informed Martha Deane that he had conducted his own investigation, and he had uncovered incriminating evidence. Therefore, she would be fired. She spent another year fighting for reinstatement until finally she took an offer from the university of back pay and early retirement in December of 1955, more than 3 years after they kicked her off campus and took a paycheck. Adding insult to injury, most of the records of Deane's work at UCLA were misplaced or destroyed. It was only through oral histories taken decades later that the story came out. Officially, Martha Deane is recorded as separating from the university in 1953, and a brief biography in her file noted that she retired in 1955 after 30 years of fruitful and faithful service. Great. I should also mention one of those histories does note that Martha Deane and that assistant professor who was fired were still together as of 1969, and they had built a home outside LA. So what does all this mean for Dr. West? Well, the timelines are the same. Martha Deane got called into the administrator's office just months before West wrote his letter to One magazine. And, like Deane, the record of what happened to Dr. West is scattered or non-existent. Nobody at UCLA could find me an administrative file for Dr. West, despite the fact that he was one of the first faculty members at UCLA's new School of Medicine. As far as the timing goes, it wasn't just the climate at UCLA. West wrote his letter to One magazine only months before President Eisenhower issued Executive Order 10450, which made homosexuality grounds for disbarment from federal employment. For events that specifically relate to Dr. West, well, his attempt to camouflage the collection of blood samples from members of the Mattachine Society backfired spectacularly. He used a Red Cross blood drive as cover to collect these samples. All of this was kind of thrown together because it was an event that had already been set up by the Public Relations Committee of the Mattachine Society. Instead of setting up something more private and covert, they jumped at the chance to get it done quickly. And that might have been a problem. Because this was a PR event initially, these donations were recorded and made on behalf of the Mattachine Society. And once collected, a Red Cross employee sent the entire list of participants to the FBI. The FBI's investigation of the Mattachine Society and One magazine wasn't some idle affair. It involved bureau offices across many states and cities and was done at the personal direction of J. Edgar Hoover and Clyde Tolson. Agents went so far as to stake out a business just for advertising in One magazine. They recorded the names and addresses of anyone who subscribed to the magazine or who received one, then scoured that list to find anybody with a federal job or who served in the military. The FBI began its investigation of One magazine in May of 1953. They collected and scrutinized every issue printed from that date on, but they didn't get the few back copies from January to April until early in 1956. So it's only then that they would have seen the February 1953 issue and read West's letter. 56 also happens to be the last year I can prove West was at UCLA. It's around the last time he's given an author credit on research, and it directly precedes Klopfer using his name on the story of Mr. Wright. I should stress that I have no proof that West's disappearance was related to any actual or perceived homosexual behavior. And even if it was, I certainly have no proof that Bruno Klopfer knew anything about it. Which means attacking Klopfer's legacy for whatever did or didn't happen to West is like trying to prosecute somebody without any proof that a crime was committed. The efforts and struggles of various LGBT groups in gaining and defending their civil rights is a particularly difficult story to tell. The environment of shame and persecution that existed in the 1950s led many individuals to destroy or obfuscate their own records. Even large institutions swept incidents under the rug in the name of decency. And the AIDS pandemic literally decimated the generation of gay men who witnessed this history directly. And it could be that the difficulty in tracking down Dr. West has nothing at all to do with those people and that struggle. But if I hadn't been looking for him, I would have never learned about them. The big blank spot in West's life made me investigate this era of American history and to present a tiny piece of that much larger story. Maybe the question of what happened to Dr. West does more good without an answer. In a small and indirect way, West's work did increase understanding and awareness for a community he obviously cared about. As far as they go, that's a pretty tiny legacy. But it is something. After all that digging, after uncovering 94% of an incredible story, all I have are 3 solid conclusions. Number 1, Bruno Klopfer gets far more scientific credit than he deserves. Dr. Philip West gets far less credit than he deserves. And my final conclusion is that I desperately want to know what happened, and I probably never will. So if you know anything about this story or can point me at anyone who might know more, please get in touch. I will give you all the credit and be forever grateful. I want to thank Learned Foot and Tyler Albertario on Twitter for the help finding primary source documents. Tyler also wrote a thorough and great article on medium.com, and that's linked below. A huge thank you to Lillian Faderman for even responding to my questions. She wrote a great book about all the relevant history we talked about today, and that's also linked below. Thank you to the One Archives, the Archives of Sexuality and Gender, and the Lucas Collection, Maxwell Zuka and Russell Johnson from UCLA Library, and Isaac Fellman. Thank you all so much for the help digging into this topic. A special thank you to my patrons for supporting the channel and for allowing me to investigate and present interesting stories like this one. And to you for watching my content, for commenting on it, and for sharing it around the internet. Couple of announcements because it's been friggin' forever since I've uploaded a video. You may have noticed that the background has changed. I no longer live in a tiny 550 square foot apartment. I got a room in a house for my studio, and I set up an actual studio, which took some time, but is amazing. So thank you for the people in my life who made that happen. You know who you are. Thank you to everybody who voted in the viewer poll from a little bit ago. The winning topic was plastics. I've started to look into that and am horrified, but we're gonna get through it. We'll get that video out to y'all as soon as possible. I do want to thank everybody for helping us reach that 2,000 subscriber milestone. Maybe we'll do that by that video, but even if we don't, as a way of giving back, the plastics episode will have a drawing related to it for a couple of gifts. So stay tuned for all of that. Thanks for sticking with me. The channel is very much alive, and I should be able to focus on it more and more in the days ahead. So see you next time.